Grant Talbot rode into the town of Sweetwater Creek, Texas, on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1883, with a face like carved stone and eyes the color of smoke after a fire has eaten everything worth saving. He had been riding for a long time. Not just the 3 days since he had crossed the Red River from Indian Territory, but in a deeper sense, a way that had nothing to do with miles and saddle leather, and had everything to do with the kind of purpose that keeps a man from sleeping peacefully, even when his body is bone-tired and his horse is limping. 20 years. That was how long he had been carrying the weight of a single night in the summer of 1863, when he was 17 years old, and the world had cracked open beneath his feet like rotten floorboards. He had watched the fire from the ridge. That was the part that never left him, the part that pressed against the inside of his skull every time he closed his eyes in the dark. He had been up on the ridge checking the fence line because his father had asked him to. Because it was one of those evenings when the June sky turned the color of a bruised peach, and a man could not bear to be indoors. He had been up on the ridge when the orange glow appeared below him, and for one slow, stupid second, he had thought it was beautiful before he understood what it was. The Talbot homestead had burned in less than an hour. His father, Edmund Talbot, had not made it out. His mother, Clara, had dragged herself free of the porch collapse with burns along her left arm that never fully healed, and she had lived another 4 years before the grief and the scarring and the hollowness of it all caught up with her lungs. His younger brother, Thomas, had been 11 years old and had run in the wrong direction in his panic, and Grant had spent 2 hours in the smoke calling his name before finding him unconscious beside the old well, dragged back to safety by sheer luck and the grace of God or whatever it was that occasionally saw fit to spare a child. Thomas had grown up. Thomas had gone on to marry a woman in San Antonio and had 3 children of his own now, and Thomas had told Grant more than once, gently and then with increasing urgency, that it was time to let it go. Grant could not let it go, because he knew who had done it. He had seen the man from the ridge. He had seen the silhouette in the orange light, the particular way the figure moved, unhurried and deliberate, the way a man moves when he is doing something he has planned and has no fear of consequence. He had seen the horse, a paint mare with a distinctive blaze across its nose, and he had seen the brand on the horse's flank that belonged to a man named Calhoun Dread, who had wanted the Talbot land for 3 years, and had been refused by Edmund Talbot 3 times with increasing sharpness. Calhoun Dread had denied everything. The county sheriff in 1863 had been a man with soft hands and a softer spine who had decided that the word of a grieving 17-year-old boy counted for less than the respectability of a man who owned 200 acres and had friends in the county seat. The case had gone nowhere. Dread had bought the Talbot land for a fraction of its worth from Clara Talbot, who was too broken and too desperate to fight, and he had prospered on it for 2 decades. Grant had spent those 2 decades becoming someone capable of doing something about it. He had worked cattle drives up from Texas to Kansas, had learned to shoot with the kind of accuracy that comes not from talent but from obsession, had pinned on a deputy's badge in Abilene for 3 years and learned how the law worked and where its teeth were, and where it was merely gums. He had crossed into New Mexico territory and back, had ridden through the Panhandle and through the breaks along the Palo Duro Canyon, had followed every rumor about Calhoun Dread's whereabouts because the man had sold the Talbot land in 1871 and disappeared into the moving chaos of the post-war West, rich enough now to be slippery. And now, in the autumn of 1883, he had a solid lead. A man who matched Dread's description had been seen in and around Sweetwater Creek for the past several months. A man in his late 50s, heavyset, with a gray beard and a ring of hammered silver on his right hand. A man who called himself Cole Drummond, but who laughed in a particular high-pitched way that a former associate of Dread's had described to Grant in a saloon in Amarillo 6 weeks ago. Grant tied his horse, a steady gray gelding he called Anchor, to the rail outside the general store and walked inside because he needed salt and hard tack and coffee, and because you could learn more about a town in 10 minutes inside its general store than you could in an hour of asking questions. The bell above the door announced him. The store smelled of sawdust and dried beans, and something sweetly chemical that he identified after a moment as lye soap. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, loaded with the practical architecture of frontier life. There were bolts of calico and muslin, tins of tobacco, a case of patent medicines with labels making promises that Grant did not believe, rope and chain, and a display of iron nails sorted by size. And behind the long counter, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a pencil tucked behind her ear, and an expression of focused concentration that suggested she was in the middle of something and did not particularly welcome interruption, stood a woman who made Grant forget, for approximately 4 full seconds, that he had come in for salt. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark brown hair pinned up in a way that was practical rather than decorative, though several strands had escaped and curved against the side of her neck. Her eyes, when she looked up at him, were a shade of green-gray that reminded him of sage after rain, and they assessed him with an intelligence and a wariness that he recognized because he wore the same expression himself. Her hands were ink-stained. She had apparently been working on the ledger that lay open on the counter beside her, and she had the pencil back in her hand before he had taken 2 full steps toward her. "Help you," she said, and her voice was clear and direct and carried no particular welcome and no particular hostility either, only the efficient neutrality of a woman who had work to do. "Salt," he said. "Coffee if you have it ground. Hard tack." She moved along the counter with efficient, economical motion. "You passing through or staying?" "Staying a while, maybe." He put his hands on the counter and looked at the shelves behind her. "You sell room and board." "I sell dry goods," she said. "Mrs. Ellery on Pecan Street does rooms. Second house past the livery blue shutters." He nodded. She set the salt on the counter, then the coffee, then began to count out hard tack biscuits from a tin. "New around here?" he asked. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I've run this store for 4 years. You're the one who is new." There was no edge to it. It was simply accurate, and he found himself almost smiling. "Grant Talbot," he said. She turned back to the counter and wrote the items in her ledger. "Myrtle Townsend." She said it the way a person states a fact, not as an invitation, not as a pleasantry. "That will be 40 cents. He paid and gathered his supplies and walked back out into the autumn light and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk with the sun warm on the side of his face, thinking about sage after rain. He put it aside. He had work to do. He found lodging with Mrs. Ellery, a brisk woman of 60 who served breakfast at 6 and dinner at 7, and had no patience for men who returned after 10 o'clock. He stabled Anchor at the livery at the end of the main street, which was run by a man named Peavy who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand and who talked enough for 3 ordinary people. "You looking for work?" Peavy asked as Grant paid for Anchor's stall and a measure of oats. "Not particularly," Grant said. "Looking for a man, maybe. Name of Cole Drummond, or he might go by other names. Heavy-set, gray beard, got a silver ring on his right hand." Peavy went still in a way that was almost theatrical. "What's your business with him?" "Personal matter," Grant said. Peavy studied him with the sharp assessment of a man who has seen enough trouble pass through a livery stable to recognize its different shapes. "He comes in most Fridays to stable his horse when he wants to do his drinking in town instead of riding back to his camp after. He have a camp out past the Connolly Creek crossing, maybe 4 miles north. He's been out there since spring. Nobody quite sure what he's doing, but he's paid his bills and stayed out of serious trouble, so." Peavy shrugged. "Friday," Grant said. "Friday," Peavy confirmed. "That was Wednesday." Grant had 2 days, and he spent the first of them being quiet and careful, and watching the town settle into its patterns around him. He ate his meals at Mrs. Ellery's table with 3 other lodgers, a traveling salesman named Horace Belk, who never stopped talking, a quiet schoolteacher named Mr. Sims who read at the table, and a young man of about 20 named Declan Pryor who worked at the mill and went red in the face at nearly everything. He spent the second day, Thursday, walking through town with the casual, unhurried movement of a man who is merely getting his bearings, and he ended up, in the late afternoon, back at the general store because he had genuinely forgotten to buy matches, and because he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that there was a secondary reason. The store was quiet at that hour. Myrtle Townsend was at the back, reorganizing a section of shelving with the focused energy of someone who has identified a problem and intends to correct it without ceremony. She had the same practical efficiency he had noticed the first day, and she acknowledged his presence with a glance and a nod and went back to her work. He bought his matches. He did not leave immediately. "Quiet town," he said. She looked at him from the shelving. "It has its moments." "How long has it been here?" "Sweetwater Creek." She came around the end of the aisle with a length of shelf paper in her hands. "Incorporated in 1874. Before that it was just the creek crossing and a trading post. My father-in-law built this store in 1875. She paused, and something crossed her face that was too practiced to be fresh grief, but too real to be indifference. "My husband took it over in 1879. He passed in 1881. "I'm sorry," Grant said, and meant it simply. She set the shelf paper on the counter and trimmed it with a pair of scissors. "He was a good man. The store keeps me in purpose." She said it without self-pity and without the kind of bravery that calls attention to itself. She just said it. He watched her work for a moment. "You run it yourself?" "I have a boy who comes in for the heavy lifting, young Billy Marsh. But the accounts and the orders and the daily running, yes." She looked up at him. "Was there something else you needed, Mr. Talbot?" He realized he had been standing there holding his matches for a fairly long time. "No," he said, "just the matches." He walked back out into the street, and this time the warm feeling in his chest lasted considerably longer before he put it aside. Friday came in cool and clear, the sky the kind of deep autumn blue that seemed impossibly generous after the dry heat of summer. Grant was at the livery by noon, helping Peavy with no particular task, just being present in the way that a patient man can be present without creating pressure. He had cleaned and loaded his Colt Peacemaker that morning, not because he intended to shoot anyone, but because a man facing 20 years of accumulated purpose should at least be prepared. Cole Drummond rode in just after 2 in the afternoon. Grant saw him from the livery doorway, and his whole body went tight and then still, the way a wire goes tight before it snaps. The man was heavy-set, gray-bearded, riding a brown horse, and on his right hand as he lifted it to pull down his hat against the sun, Grant could see the dull gleam of a silver ring. He was older than Grant's memory of him, older than the shadow on the ridge, because 20 years and 3 months does change a man's shape and color. But the way he moved, the particular unhurried deliberateness of it, the way he swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who has never spent much time worried about consequences, that was exactly the same. Grant's throat closed. He breathed through his nose slowly until it opened again. He was not going to kill Calhoun Dredd in the street of Sweetwater Creek, Texas, in 1883. He was not going to give him the dignity of a quick death and not give his father's memory the dignity of justice. He had thought about this for 20 years, and he had arrived at something more considered than simple murder. He waited until Dredd, or Drummond as he was calling himself, had stabled his horse and gone up the street toward the saloon. Then he walked to the telegraph office on the east side of the main street and sent 2 wires. One to the county sheriff in the seat town of Harlan, 40 miles south, a man named Crawford who Grant had been corresponding with for the past 2 months and who had agreed, on the basis of the evidence Grant had assembled, that there was enough to bring Calhoun Dredd in for questioning regarding the arson and manslaughter case from 1863. The second wire went to Thomas in San Antonio. "Come if you can." Then he walked up the street and went into the saloon. He did not sit near Dredd. He took a place at the far end of the bar with a glass of something amber that he barely touched, and let his eyes do their work over the reflection in the dirty mirror behind the bar. Dredd was at a table with two other men, playing cards, laughing in that high-pitched way that the man in Amarillo had described and that Grant had been hearing in his memory for 20 years. Up close, the laugh was almost nothing, almost ordinary. It was strange how ordinary evil sounded when it was just a sound a man made over a hand of cards. He sat there for an hour. He did not approach Dredd. He was waiting for Crawford's response, and he was not going to take any action that might spook the man before the law was in place to receive him. When he walked back out of the saloon, he nearly collided with Myrtle Townsend on the wooden sidewalk. She was carrying a basket of goods, apparently making a delivery to the dress shop 2 doors down, and she stepped back sharply at his sudden emergence, and he caught the basket by instinct before anything could fall. "Sorry," he said, steadying the basket and then steadying her by the elbow. She was warm through her sleeve, and she looked up at him with those rain-sage eyes wide and then narrowing back to their usual composure. "Mr. Talbot," she said. She took the basket back with a firm grip. "Do you make a habit of exploding out of saloons?" "First time," he said. She looked at him with the slightly longer assessment she gave things she was not entirely sure about. "You look like something has you wound up tight." He considered how much to say. Might be so. She held his gaze for a moment more, and then something in her expression shifted, not toward sentimentality but toward a kind of quiet seriousness that he recognized as genuine attention. "Are you in trouble?" "Not me," he said. "I'm hoping to deliver it." She did not press him. She adjusted her grip on the basket and gave him a small, measured nod. "Well, mind yourself." She walked on down the sidewalk, and he watched her go for a moment before walking to the telegraph office to check for a reply. Crawford's wire came back within the hour. "Sheriff on his way. 2 days. Do not engage. 2 days." Grant went back to Mrs. Ellery's, ate his supper, and did not sleep. In those 2 days, Sweetwater Creek continued its ordinary business around him, indifferent to the coiled tension of the man living in Mrs. Ellery's back room. And in those 2 days, something else happened that Grant had not budgeted for, which was that he found himself spending time with Myrtle Townsend in ways that were entirely mundane and entirely unlike anything he had felt in a very long time. It began on Saturday morning when he stopped into the store to ask if she carried writing paper, because he wanted to write Thomas a proper letter to go with the telegraph. She did carry writing paper, and while she was getting it, she asked him if he had heard about the circuit preacher coming through the following week, and he said he had not, and she said she supposed it mattered less to some than to others, and he said he had not spent much time in churches of late but that he respected the principle. She smiled at that. It was a small smile, and it came and went quickly, but it was genuine, and it changed the whole geometry of her face in a way that startled him pleasantly. On Saturday afternoon, he was walking back from the livery, when a shout from the direction of the general store brought him around fast. It was nothing dangerous, as it turned out, only young Billy Marsh having dropped a 50-pound sack of flour from the wagon, the result being a spectacular white explosion across the street, and Billy covered head to foot in white powder, looking stunned and somewhat ghostly. But Grant had already crossed the street in a run by the time he understood the situation, and Myrtle was standing in the doorway of the store laughing, actually laughing, with her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes bright with it. He stopped in the street and looked at her laughing, and felt something unlock in his chest that he had not known was locked. He helped Billy carry the remaining sacks inside, and afterward Myrtle poured him a cup of coffee from the pot she kept on the small iron stove at the back of the store, and they stood in the late afternoon warmth of the cluttered storeroom and drank it together without a great deal of words and without any awkwardness about the absence of words, which Grant took to be a significant thing. "You have the look of a man who is waiting for something," she said at last. "I am. Good waiting or bad waiting?" He thought about it honestly. "Both, maybe." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "My husband waited 3 years to build the addition to this store. He drew plans and revised them and drew them again and talked about it every evening after supper. He passed before he broke ground." She was not being mournful, she was making a point. "I finished it myself the summer after he died, hired the Connolly boys and directed every plank myself." She looked at him level and clear. "Whatever you are waiting for, Mr. Talbot, I hope you have planned it better than you have executed it so far." He almost laughed. "What makes you think I haven't executed it well?" "You have been in this town 3 days," she said, "and I know your name, your horse's name, and that you are looking for a man named Drummond or possibly something else, because Peavy cannot hold a secret to save his life." Grant set his cup down and looked at her. "I don't know what the matter is between you and him," she said, "and I am not asking. But whatever it is has been chewing at you from the inside for a long time, and a man who has been chewed at from the inside for a long time sometimes forgets to look at what is in front of him." She refilled his cup without asking. He sat with that for a while. "It's been 20 years, he said, and was surprised to hear himself say it aloud. "That is a long time to carry something," she said simply. "It is," he agreed. They finished their coffee. He thanked her and left and walked back to Mrs. Ellery's in the cooling dusk, and for the first time in as long as he could remember he fell asleep without an effort. Sunday brought Sheriff Crawford and 2 deputies riding in from the south at mid-morning, and Grant met them at the edge of town and spent an hour explaining the full account, the witness statements he had gathered, the land records, the testimony of former associates of Calhoun Dredd that placed him at the Talbot property in June of 1863, the brand registry records that matched the paint mare to Dredd's known string. Crawford was a solid, methodical man with a square jaw and the unhurried manner of someone who does not need to perform authority because he actually has it. He reviewed the documents Grant had assembled in an oilskin pouch and listened to the account without interruption. "This is enough to hold him," Crawford said. "Whether it holds up at trial depends on how the circuit judge reads 20-year-old testimony, but we bring him in." "That's all I'm asking," Grant said. They found Calhoun Dredd, also known as Cole Drummond, at the camp north of Connolly Creek at about 2 in the afternoon. Grant rode with Crawford and the deputies, which Crawford had agreed to after Grant made clear that he had better information than anyone else, and that he would ride out there with or without them. Crawford had accepted this with the pragmatic wisdom of a man who knows when an argument is worth having. Dredd was not expecting them. He was sitting outside his canvas tent with a cup in his hand and a fire burning low, and he looked up at the sound of approaching horses with an expression that shifted through several things quickly: recognition and calculation and a brief flash of something that might have been fear, before settling into the particular blankness of a man deciding how to play his hand. "Cole Drummond," Crawford said. "That's me. Also known as Calhoun Dredd." The blankness cracked a little. Dredd looked at Grant, and Grant looked back at him, and between them passed 20 years of fire and smoke and a boy on a ridge watching his world burn. "Don't know what you mean," Dredd said. Crawford read the charges quietly and with authority: arson resulting in death, specifically the death of Edmund Talbot of Haskell County in June of 1863. He had one of his deputies put the irons on Dredd's wrists. Dredd said nothing more. He looked at Grant once more as the deputies led him toward the horses, and Grant met the look without flinching and without satisfaction, because he had imagined this moment for 20 years and the reality of it was quieter and sadder than the imagining, as most realities are. Crawford clapped Grant on the shoulder. "Your brother wired me this morning. He is riding up from San Antonio. Said he'll be here by Tuesday." "Good," Grant said. His voice was steady. He was fine. He was completely fine. He rode back to Sweetwater Creek and went to the livery and saw to Anchor and brushed him down with more thoroughness than the horse strictly required, and at some point his hand slowed and stopped and he stood with his forehead against Anchor's neck in the dim, warm smell of hay and horse and let out a breath that had been waiting 20 years to be let go. The horse stood patiently, the way good horses do. He was standing outside the livery some time later, in the cooling Sunday afternoon, when Myrtle walked past with a shawl around her shoulders and a basket of mending under her arm. She was on her way home, he supposed. She lived, he had gathered, in the rooms above the store. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at his face with that particular directness she had. "It happened," she said. "It was not a question." "It happened," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" "I think so." He looked at the street. "I thought I would feel different." "What did you think you would feel?" He considered it. "I don't know, something larger. It is smaller than I expected." She nodded slowly. That is how most important things are when they finally arrive. Smaller, quieter, more real. She shifted the basket under her arm. "Come and have supper. I always cook too much." He looked at her. She was practical and unglamorous and entirely sincere, and the invitation was given in the same no-nonsense tone she used for everything, and it was possibly the most genuinely kind thing anyone had said to him in years. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You are not imposing," she said. "I am inviting. There is a difference." She turned and walked up the street, and after a moment he fell into step beside her. Her rooms above the store were small and clean, and full of the evidence of a life lived practically, and with attention. There were bookshelves made from planks and crates, loaded with volumes that had clearly been read more than once. There was a needlework piece above the fireplace that was half-finished, and had apparently been half-finished for some time, abandoned rather than abandoned. There was a small framed photograph on the mantel of a man with a kind face and tired eyes who Grant understood to be her late husband. She did not draw attention to it or away from it. She made a stew with dried beef and potatoes and onions that was straightforward and hot and deeply good, and they ate at the small table by the window with the autumn dark coming in around the edges of the curtain. She asked him about his brother Thomas. He told her about Thomas, about San Antonio, about Thomas's children whose names were Eliza and Marcus and little Edmund, named for their grandfather. His voice changed slightly when he said his father's name, and he noticed that she noticed, but she did not comment on it. She told him in return about her own people, who were from Missouri originally, her father a farmer and her mother a schoolteacher, herself the middle child of 5. She had come west at 21 with her husband James Townsend, who had been adventurous in the best way and impractical in a few ways, and had loved her faithfully, and had died of a fever in the summer of 1881 that had also taken 3 other men in the county. She spoke about him with the clear-eyed affection of someone who has grieved properly and put it in the right place, not behind her but beside her, where it was part of her rather than a weight on her. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Now that you have done the thing you came for." He had not thought that far. It occurred to him, with something like surprise, that he had not thought much at all past the moment of Dread's arrest. 20 years of forward motion, and he had never clearly imagined what came after, as though the future beyond that point had been a blank wall. "I don't know," he said. "That is honest, at least," she said. He looked at her across the small table. She had a candle between them, and its light did interesting things to the lines of her face, the intelligence in it, the steadiness. "Do you like it here?" he asked. "Sweetwater Creek." She considered it. "I have made it mine," she said. "Whether I like it or whether I made it mine through liking it, I am not sure, but it is mine, and that counts for more than liking." "A fair distinction," he said. After supper she made coffee and they sat by the fire, and he found himself talking in a way he had not talked to anyone in a very long time, not with the walls up, not with the careful management of information and impression. He told her about the ridge. He told her about the fire. He told her about the 2 hours calling Thomas's name through the smoke, and the feeling of the boy's pulse under his fingers when he found him, and how that pulse had been the most important single sensation of his life. She listened the way a person listens when they are genuinely present, without preparing their next observation or their comfort or their opinion, simply being there while he spoke. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Your father," she said, "what was he like?" Nobody had asked him that in 20 years, not about who his father was, only about what happened, only about Dread, only about the fire. "He laughed too loud," Grant said slowly. "He embarrassed me sometimes when I was young. He was too generous. He would give things to people who needed them, and then we would go short because of it, and Mother would be practical about it for both of them. He paused. He could fix anything mechanical. Any machine you put in front of him, he could understand inside of 20 minutes. He used to say that machines were honest because they always did exactly what their design required. He stopped again. He was a good man. He sounds like one, Myrtle said quietly. They sat with the fire for a while longer, and the domesticity of it, the ordinary human warmth of sitting by a fire in a small room with someone who was paying attention, was so entirely new to Grant after 20 years of purposeful solitude that he did not quite know what to do with it except to sit still and let it happen. He left before 9 so as not to run afoul of Mrs. Ellery's rules, and he said goodnight on the landing outside her door, and she said goodnight in return. And as he walked back down the outside stairs into the cool night, he was aware that something had shifted in him that had nothing to do with Calhoun dread. Thomas arrived on Tuesday, as Crawford had said, riding up from San Antonio on a good bay horse with the broad shoulders and sun-darkened face of a man who has worked outdoors his whole life. He was 31 now, Thomas, 20 years younger than Grant's memory of him as an 11-year-old boy running through smoke, and it was always slightly startling to see him as he actually was, a grown man with children and a life, and the particular unbroken quality of someone who had been carried through the worst night of his life before he was old enough to understand it. They embraced in the street in front of the livery, briefly and without embarrassment. "Sheriff Crawford says they will hold him at Harlan until the circuit judge comes through," Thomas said. "Could be 3 months. "I know." Thomas looked at him carefully. "How do you feel?" "People keep asking me that," Grant said. "Because it matters," Thomas said. "Because I have been worried about you for 20 years." Grant looked at his brother. "I feel like I can breathe," he said finally. "It is different from what I expected, but that is what it is." Thomas nodded. "Good," he said. "Good." They had supper together at the hotel, which had a small dining room that made a reasonable effort, and Thomas told him about Eliza and Marcus and little Edmund, who had just turned 3 and had apparently strong opinions about most things. Grant listened and laughed in the right places and was surprised by how naturally the laughing came. "You look different," Thomas said over his second cup of coffee. "I just told you I feel different." "Not just that," Thomas said with the particular attention of a younger sibling who has learned to read an older one from the outside. "You look like someone who has remembered there is something to look forward to." He tilted his head slightly. "Is there something here worth staying for?" Grant said nothing, which was an answer in itself. Thomas smiled into his coffee cup. "I would like to meet her," he said. "There is nothing to meet," Grant said. "Grant," Thomas said patiently. They went to the general store the following morning under the entirely reasonable pretext that Thomas needed a new pair of gloves for the ride back. Myrtle was behind the counter in her usual attitude of competent occupation, and she looked up when the door opened and saw Grant and then saw the man with him and arrived immediately at the correct conclusion, because she was perceptive. "Good morning," she said. "Myrtle Townsend," Grant said. "This is my brother Thomas." "I have heard about you," Thomas said warmly, shaking her hand across the counter with the open friendliness that had always been his particular gift and that Grant had always somewhat envied. "Grant says you run this store entirely yourself." "Grant is being generous," Myrtle said. "Billy Marsh runs the heavy end of things," but she was smiling. Thomas tried on gloves and bought 2 pairs and managed to spend 45 minutes in the store, which was not remotely necessary for the purchase of gloves. He asked Myrtle about the town and the store and how long she had been in Sweetwater Creek, and she answered all of it without impatience. And Grant stood nearby and was intermittently embarrassed by his brother and intermittently grateful. When they left, Thomas waited until they were a full block down the street before he said anything. "She is exceptional," he said. "Don't," Grant said. "I am merely observing." "I know what you are observing." Thomas was quiet for a moment and then he said something more serious. You have spent 20 years with no room in your life for anything except the one purpose. Now the purpose is finished. Do not fill the space with more wandering, Grant. You are 37 years old. You are not too old to build something." Grant walked on. The autumn light fell golden on the main street of Sweetwater Creek, on the wooden storefronts and the horses at the rail and the ordinary life going on in every direction. "I know," he said at last. "Thomas stayed 3 days." He rode back to San Antonio on a Thursday morning with his new gloves and a warmth between them that Grant recognized as something repaired, something that had been damaged in the smoke of 1863 and had been slowly finding its way back ever since. He watched his brother ride south until the bay horse was a small shape and then nothing, and stood in the street for a while after. What happened in the weeks that followed was not dramatic in the way that the previous 20 years had been dramatic. It was quiet and it was gradual, and it was, in its quiet gradualness, more powerful than anything Grant had experienced in the whole long-driven run of his adult life. He stayed in Sweetwater Creek. He told himself, with the self-awareness of a man who knows when he is telling himself something for a reason, that he needed to be available if Crawford needed additional testimony, that he had nowhere in particular to be, that Anchor could use the rest. These things were all true. They were not the whole truth. He took a job at the livery, helping Peavy, because he needed to do something with his hands and because the livery was practical, and because Peavy's endless talking was oddly soothing now that Grant was not wound so tight. He was good with horses, always had been, and Peavy was glad enough to have the help that he did not ask too many questions. He found himself stopping at the general store most evenings, ostensibly for one small thing or another, a box of matches, a tin of tobacco that he barely used, a length of rope. Myrtle did not draw attention to the frequency or the pattern of the visits. She simply handed him what he asked for and made change, and then, because the store was often quiet in the evenings, she made coffee on the small iron stove. They talked. They talked more than Grant had talked to anyone in years, and the talking was easy in a way he had not expected because she was not easy in the sentimental sense. She did not make conversation easy by making it soft. She made it easy by being honest, by saying what she thought and expecting the same, by not performing either interest or disinterest but simply being genuinely present. She had opinions about the cattle drives and the railroad and the state of the cotton market and the iniquity of certain land grant practices that had pushed native people off their land, and she held her opinions with the same practical firmness she held everything, not dogmatically but honestly. She had been reading a copy of a newspaper from Austin that had come in with a supply wagon, and she read him a piece from it about the conditions in the Indian Territory and said that the whole business was a shame and a corruption, and that she could not see how any person with a functioning conscience could think otherwise. He agreed with her. He had ridden through Indian Territory several times and had seen enough to form views similar to hers. "You are surprisingly well-read," she said one evening. Not as a compliment exactly, or not only as a compliment, but with the appreciation of someone who has found an unexpected correspondent. "I had a lot of campfires," he said. "A man needs something to do with the dark." She smiled. The smile came more easily now, more often, and each time he saw it he felt the same pleasant startlement, as though it was new every time. One evening in early November, there was a hard rain that started at dusk and turned the main street of Sweetwater Creek into a running river of mud. Myrtle closed the store early because nobody was going to be coming in, and she was at the stove making something that smelled like cinnamon when Grant arrived at the back door, soaked through and somewhat ridiculous, because he had been at the far end of the livery when the rain started and had taken a while to make it to shelter. She looked at him in his dripping state and pressed her lips together against a smile. "Do not laugh," he said. She laughed. It was the fullest laugh he had heard from her, not the suppressed amusement she usually showed, but a real laugh, warm and bright and completely unself-conscious, and it did something to his chest that he was fairly sure would be permanent. She found him a dry shirt that had been her husband's, which fit reasonably well across the shoulders if not perfectly in length, and he sat by the stove while his shirt dried over the rack, and she made spiced apple jam from a bushel of late apples that had come in from a farmer north of town. "Tell me something about Missouri," he said, "since you are from there." She stirred the pot and told him about the particular green of the Missouri River bottoms in the spring, and how the trees there were so different from the flat, open country of Texas, all layered and dense and full of bird sound, and how she had grieved the trees when she first arrived in the West because she had not expected to miss them and so had been unprepared. She told him about her mother teaching at a one-room schoolhouse, and how her mother had the philosophy that you could not teach a child who was hungry, and had kept a basket of bread in the schoolroom every day from her own kitchen. "She sounds like someone worth admiring," Grant said. "She was the best person I knew," Myrtle said simply. "She died when I was 16. After that I had my father and my brothers and sisters, but the center was different." She glanced at him. "You understand that, losing the center?" "Yes," he said. The rain hammered the roof, and the stove was warm, and the smell of the apple jam was sweet and specific. And Grant sat in that small room and understood with a clarity that had nothing abstract about it that this was the life he had been without for 20 years. Not the wandering, not the purpose, not the long horseback miles and the campfire reading and the careful assembly of evidence and witness statements. This. A warm kitchen with a good woman in it and the rain on the roof and no particular emergency. He had been afraid of it. That was the honest admission. He had been afraid of stopping because stopping meant feeling everything he had kept at a manageable distance by moving, and now he had stopped and the feeling was not what he had feared. It was bearable. It was more than bearable. Myrtle poured the finished jam into jars and sealed them and set them in a row on the shelf, and turned around to find him watching her. She looked back at him steadily. There was something between them that had been building for 3 weeks and that they had both, with the characteristic caution of people who have been hurt by loss, been careful not to name. But in the warm kitchen with the rain pouring down, the unnamed thing was taking up most of the available space. "You are planning to stay," she said. It was neither a question nor quite a statement. "I am considering it," he said. "What is your consideration?" He looked at her. "I do not want to stay in a town and then leave it," he said. "I have done enough leaving. If I stay somewhere, I intend to stay." She held his gaze with that clear green-gray directness. "That seems like a reasonable position," she said. "It requires something to stay for," he said. The rain fell. The stove crackled. "Well," she said, and her voice was careful and quiet and entirely honest, "you appear to have found a great deal to occupy yourself with here already." He stood up from the stool. He was very aware of the distance between them, which was the width of the kitchen, and then he crossed it, not quickly but not hesitantly either, and she did not step back. "Myrtle," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was looking up at him with an expression that was not quite composed in its usual way, that had the same undone quality as when she had laughed at him standing soaked in the doorway, entirely real and entirely undefended. He took her hand, her ink-stained, practical hand, in both of his. "I think I would like to court you," he said, "properly, if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel the pulse in her wrist. "I am willing," she said. "Though I should warn you that I have strong opinions about most things, and I do not manage a store without having a head for business, and I am not a woman who will pretend otherwise to make a man comfortable." "I know that," he said. "It is a significant part of the appeal." She almost smiled. Then she fully smiled, the warm, bright one, and his heart did the thing it had been doing since the first time he saw it. "All right, then," she said. What followed was the most straightforwardly joyful period of Grant Talbot's adult life. He was not sure he entirely trusted it at first. He kept waiting for the feeling of it to become complicated in the ways that most things became complicated, for some new obstacle to materialize on the horizon, the way obstacles always had. But November passed into December, and the small town of Sweetwater Creek turned cold, and the days shortened, and he and Myrtle built the slow, comfortable architecture of two people who are learning each other deliberately and with care. He took her to dinner at the hotel on Saturday evenings. She read to him from her books on Sunday afternoons, when the store was closed, sitting in the armchairs by her fireplace with the wood smoke smell filling the room. He helped her with the end-of-year inventory, which was a considerable task, and she directed him with efficiency and occasional exasperation when he miscounted and had to be corrected. And both of these things, the efficiency and the exasperation, seemed to him to be evidence of something comfortable and real. He fixed a section of the roof above the storeroom that had developed a slow leak when the first winter rain came. He climbed up there on a cold December morning with a bag of tools and a length of roofing felt, and spent 3 hours in the wind getting it right. Myrtle came out with hot coffee and stood in the alley below and watched him work and told him when he was missing a spot, which he was, and he was grateful for the information. When he came down, she handed him the coffee without comment, and they stood in the alley drinking it, and he said, "Your husband was going to fix that eventually." "He was," she said. "I should have hired someone sooner." "You have someone now," he said. He said it simply, without pressure, and she received it the same way simply. The circuit court convened in Harlan in late January of 1884. Grant rode down for the proceedings, which lasted 4 days. The case against Calhoun Dredd, presented by a prosecutor who had done thorough work with the evidence Grant had assembled, came down substantially to the testimony of 2 former associates of Dredd's who confirmed his presence near the Talbot property on the night in question. The land records showing Dredd's subsequent acquisition of the property at below market value from a widow shortly after the fire, and Grant's own account of what he had witnessed from the ridge at the age of 17. Dredd's attorney argued that 20-year-old testimony was unreliable and that circumstantial evidence was insufficient. The circuit judge, a careful and stern man named Hargrove, took 2 hours in deliberation and returned a verdict of guilty on the arson count and a lesser count of manslaughter, finding that while deliberate murder could not be proven beyond the required standard, the evidence clearly established that Dredd had set the fire with disregard for the lives of those within. He was sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary at Huntsville. It was not hanging. Grant had thought at various points over the years that he would want hanging, but sitting in the courtroom when the sentence was read, he found that he was satisfied. His father was named in the official record. The act was acknowledged. The man who had done it would spend his remaining useful years behind bars and would die in an institution rather than on his own terms. It was justice in its real form, imperfect and procedural and honest, and Grant found that he could accept it. He rode back to Sweetwater Creek in February, through weather that was cold and sharp, and Myrtle was in the store when he arrived, as she always was, and she looked up from the counter and saw something in his face and came around the counter and took both his cold hands in hers and said, "Tell me." He told her. All of it, the verdict and the sentence and the judge's words and the way Dredd had looked when they took him out, diminished and gray and ordinary. She listened to all of it. Then she squeezed his hands and said, "Your father would be glad." He stood in the warm store with her hands around his and the familiar smell of sawdust and coffee and dried goods around him, and he thought about Edmund Talbot, who could fix any machine and who laughed too loudly and who had been generous to a fault, and he thought, yes, his father would be glad. He was glad. "I have been thinking," he said. "A general condition," she said, which was her way, always a little dry, always precise. "About staying," he said. "About Sweetwater Creek specifically." He looked at her. "Peavy has mentioned that he would be willing to take a partner in the livery if the right man came along. I have some money saved. Not a great deal, but enough, combined with what the business brings." Myrtle looked at him with her clear, steady eyes. "And I have been thinking," he said, "about whether you would want to marry a man who runs the local livery stable." The store was very quiet. Outside, somewhere, a horse was walking on the frozen mud of the main street, and the sound of its hooves was crisp and clear in the cold air. "I would want to marry a man," she said at last with great precision, "who is honorable and hardworking and honest and who challenges me to think and who is good with horses and who fixed my roof in December when the wind was terrible and who happens to run the local livery stable, if that is the same man." "It is," he said. "Then yes," she said, "I would be willing to discuss the terms." He laughed. He had not expected to laugh, but he did, and it came from somewhere deep and real. "You want to negotiate the terms of a marriage proposal. I want us to go into it clearly," she said. "I have managed this store myself for 3 years, and I intend to go on managing it. It is mine, and it is my livelihood and my purpose, and I will not give it up." "I would not ask you to," he said. "And I have strong opinions," she said. "I know. And I do not always show things on the surface that I feel underneath," she said, and her voice was slightly less steady here, slightly more real. "But that does not mean I do not feel them." "I know that too," he said gently. She looked at him, and underneath the composure that she always wore, he could see what she had just told him, the feeling that was underneath, and it was warm and real and brave, because she had lost someone before, and she was choosing to risk it again anyway. "Then yes," she said again, more simply this time. "Grant Talbot, yes." He kissed her there in the general store among the bolts of calico and the tins of tobacco and the shelves of practical necessities, and she kissed him back with the same deliberate honesty she brought to everything, and it was very far from the impulsive, consuming romances of the stories he had occasionally read in those campfire years, but it was entirely true, and truth was better. They were married in April of 1884. When the Texas spring had broken through the winter with its characteristic abruptness, turning the land from brown to startling green in what seemed like a single week. The circuit preacher who came through Sweetwater Creek performed the ceremony in the small white-painted church at the north end of the main street, with Thomas and his wife Clara, who had ridden up from San Antonio for the occasion, as witnesses, and Peavy beaming in the front row, and young Billy Marsh in a clean shirt that was too large for him, looking solemn and pleased. Myrtle wore a dress of pale blue that she had made herself over the winter evenings, practical in cut and beautiful in the making, with a small bunch of early spring flowers from the creek bank pinned at her collar. Grant wore his best coat and had his boots polished and stood at the front of the church waiting for her with the peculiar feeling of a man at the edge of something so good that he does not quite trust it. When she walked in on Thomas's offered arm, because her own father was in Missouri and too old to travel, Grant stopped not trusting it. She walked with the same direct, unhurried certainty she walked into every room, and her eyes found his immediately and did not look away. And in those gray-green eyes was everything, the steadiness and the warmth and the intelligence and the brave honesty of a woman who has decided. "I do," she said, when the moment came, in a voice that was entirely clear and entirely sure. "I do," he said, and meant it with the whole of his life. Thomas's wife Clara, who was a warm and expressive woman quite different from her reserved sister-in-law, wept a little and was not embarrassed about it. Thomas himself shook Grant's hand after and then pulled him into an embrace and said into his ear, "Father would be glad of this too." "I know," Grant said. His voice was rough. Peavy organized a supper in the saloon, which had been cleared of its more disreputable furnishings for the occasion, and the whole town of Sweetwater Creek turned out with a generosity that suggested the town had been paying closer attention to the developing romance than Grant had perhaps realized. There was music from 2 fiddles and a harmonica, and Myrtle danced with Grant in the cleared space in the middle of the room with her hand firm in his and her face bright. And he thought he had never in his life seen anything better than this woman moving in the golden light with her hair coming down from its pins and her eyes on his. They set up their life with the practical efficiency that characterized everything Myrtle did. They kept her rooms above the store, adding to them by taking the adjoining space that had been used for storage and converting it into a proper bedroom and a larger sitting room. Grant brought very little from his previous life, because his previous life had been carried in bags and on horses and did not amount to much in the domestic sense. But what he brought was real, and it fit into the space she had made. He bought into the livery partnership with Peavy and May, and the business of horses and the maintenance of them, and the particular economic life of a town that depended on horses for everything from hauling goods to getting a doctor in an emergency, filled his days with a purpose that was entirely different from the driven obsession of the past 20 years and entirely more sustaining. He was good at it. He had always been good with horses, but now the goodness was not instrumental, not in service of getting somewhere else. It was the thing itself. The livery prospered. Peavy, relieved of the most strenuous physical demands by his new partner, became, if possible, even more talkative but also more cheerful, and the two of them worked in a comfortable rhythm that suited them both. Myrtle ran the store with the same focused competence she had always shown, and the accounts at the end of 1884 were the best the store had seen since her husband James had built it. She had a theory about ordering that involved anticipating seasonal needs 3 months in advance rather than responding to them, and it turned out to be correct, and the winter of 1884 found Sweetwater Creek with adequate lamp oil and warm blankets and salt pork because of it. They argued sometimes, the way honest people who live in close quarters and have strong opinions argue, about the fence line of the property behind the livery, about whether a particular apple cider vinegar had gone off or not, about the best way to write a letter to a supplier who had sent the wrong weight of rope 2 months running. The arguments were brief and real and concluded without residue, because they were both people who had learned through harder experience than most what was actually worth carrying and what was not. They were in love. It was not the word Grant would naturally have reached for, but it was accurate. He loved the way she set her coffee cup down precisely, always in the same spot. He loved the way she read, silently and fast, moving through pages the way other people moved through water. He loved the way she was quietly, unfailingly kind to people who were having difficulty, without announcing the kindness or requiring gratitude for it. He loved her opinions and her precision, and the moments when she laughed fully and without reservation, and the moments when she was moved by something, and did not quite hide it, and then composed herself and carried on. She had said that she did not always show what she felt on the surface, but over the months of their marriage he learned the surface better and could read it, the particular stillness that meant she was moved, the slight softening around her eyes that meant she was content, the way she sometimes reached for his hand without looking at him when they were sitting reading in the evenings, as though she had simply wanted to confirm that he was there. In the late autumn of 1884, she told him quietly over breakfast one morning that she thought they might be expecting a child. He set down his coffee. He looked at her. She was watching him with the expression she wore when she was not quite sure how something was going to land, composed but attentive underneath. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Not entirely, but fairly." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she said, "Grant," with a slight edge of uncertainty. "I am trying," he said carefully, "to understand how it is possible to feel this much at one time." The edge left her expression. The softening came in around her eyes. "I think," she said, "that is the correct response." He came around the table and held her, and she leaned against him in the easy way she had learned, the way that was unlike her public posture, private and completely trusting, and outside the window the November wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood tree at the corner of the building. Thomas came up from San Antonio for Christmas that year, with Clara and all 3 children. Little Edmund, who was 4, attached himself immediately to Grant with the uncomplicated confidence of young children, and Grant found himself on Christmas afternoon on the floor of the sitting room building an elaborate structure from sticks and scraps with this small person, who had his grandfather's name. And the weight of the name in that small body was almost unbearable in the best way. Myrtle sat in her chair and watched them and was reading or pretending to read, and when Grant looked up at her she was not reading at all, She was watching him with that soft, particular expression that she kept for the things that moved her, and she did not look away when he caught her, just held his gaze steadily with everything visible. He was going to be a father. The enormity of it had been settling on him in layers since November, each layer revealing something underneath that he had not known was there. He had spent 20 years with no future, or rather with a future that was entirely defined by one purpose, and the purpose had been achieved, and the future had turned out to be this: a small town in Texas, and a woman with ink-stained hands and a child coming in the spring, and it was more than he had known to ask for. The winter passed in the particular intimacy of two people sharing a life in close quarters through cold months, learning each other's small patterns and preferences and tolerances in the way that the larger seasons do not reveal, but the indoor domestic months inevitably do. Myrtle had a habit of working through her concerns about things in the night, and then presenting him in the morning with fully formed thoughts, and he learned to receive the morning thoughts as the product of invisible overnight labor rather than sudden announcements. She learned that he woke early and needed an hour of quiet before he was ready for conversation, and she accommodated this without making it a point of negotiation. She was not sick in the way she had heard some women were sick in early pregnancy, but she was tired in a way she found frustrating, and she did not like being frustrated, and this resulted in a period of about 6 weeks in which she was shorter with customers than was strictly her custom, and came home in the evenings with a crease between her brows that only eased when she sat down and put her feet up. Grant brought her cups of tea without being asked, which was not something he had known how to do before marriage and had learned from careful attention, and she accepted them with a grateful brevity that communicated more than effusive thanks would have. Their son was born in late May of 1885, on a warm evening when the creek at the edge of town was running high from the spring rains and the cottonwoods were in full leaf. He was healthy and loud, which the midwife, Mrs. Harkin, said was exactly what you wanted, and he had Grant's dark hair, and it seemed to Grant from the first hour, his mother's expression of decisive assessment. They named him Edmund James Talbot, Edmund for the grandfather who had not made it out of the fire and James for the man who had built the store and loved Myrtle faithfully, and the double naming felt right, a carrying forward of two good men into the life of a new one. Thomas received the letter about his nephew's arrival with apparently considerable emotion, according to the letter he wrote in return, which was warmer and more enthusiastic than Thomas usually permitted himself in writing. He said that Edmund was a fine name, and that he was proud of his brother in a way he could not entirely put into words, and that their parents, if there was any justice in the arrangement of things, were somewhere aware of what had come of what was lost. Grant read that letter on the porch above the store, in the June evening, with Edmund James asleep in the crook of his left arm and Sweetwater Creek going on below him in its ordinary and unhurrying way. He read Thomas's last line again. He looked down at the baby who had the profound, unconcerned sleep of the very young. "Your grandfather's name was Edmund," he said quietly to the sleeping child. "He was a good man. He would have loved you very much." The baby breathed and slept, and Grant sat in the evening warmth and was at peace. The store continued to thrive. Grant's partnership in the livery solidified over 1885 and into 1886, and by 1886 it was understood in Sweetwater Creek that Peavy handled the conversational end of the livery business, and Grant handled the practical end, and both aspects were served. Grant had a natural authority with horses that translated into a reputation that brought animals from a considerable distance for his care and opinion, and the business grew beyond what either he or Peavy had projected. Myrtle returned to the store 3 months after Edmund's birth, having arranged for the reliable Mrs. Harkin's daughter, a competent young woman named Adelia, to care for the baby during the working hours. She returned with the same efficiency and focus she had always brought, and the adjustment of her schedule to account for the nursing hours and the morning routines of a young child was accomplished with characteristic practicality. She did not find motherhood difficult in the way of romance, but she found it absorbing and real, and the love she had for her son was, Grant observed, very much of a piece with the love she had for everything she made her own, complete and fierce and practically expressed. There were ordinary difficulties. There was a period when the cattle fever swept through the county in 1886 and affected several of the horses in the livery, and Grant worked 20-hour days for 2 weeks managing the quarantine and the treatment and the communication with worried owners, and came home exhausted and tense and less pleasant company than usual. And Myrtle fed him and put him to bed and managed the household around him with the quiet competence of a woman who understands the difference between emotional support and practical support and offers whichever is actually needed. When the crisis was over and the horses were recovering and Grant had slept for 15 hours and come back to himself, he sat at the breakfast table and looked across at her and said simply, "Thank you." She looked up from Edmund's porridge. "For what specifically?" "For everything, these 2 weeks." She held his gaze for a moment. "That is what this is," she said. "That is the thing." He nodded. He knew. There was also a difficulty that was not domestic, that had to do with the injustice that ran through the West like a deep current beneath the ordinary surface of things. In 1887, a group of Comanche families who had been displaced from their land north of town, families that had been pushed steadily further by the expanding settlement of the Panhandle, camped for several weeks on the creek land east of Sweetwater Creek. The response of some in the town was hostile in ways that made Grant angry and Myrtle angrier, and she wrote a letter to the county paper at Harlan that was published, and that was, in the words of the editor who printed it with what appeared to be some trepidation, strongly worded. It did not solve anything systemic, because the systemic injustice was too large for a letter in a county paper to solve. But it said something true, and it was in the record, and the families were not harassed, partly because several of the more hot-headed men in town lost their nerve when they saw that Grant Talbot was going to stand in the road and look at them in a way that made further enthusiasm for harassment suddenly less appealing. Grant did not consider this a heroic act. He considered it the minimum required. Myrtle considered it characteristic and said so. Sweetwater Creek grew through the late 1880s, as the railroad extended its reach, and the cattle business continued, and new families came in from East Texas and Missouri and Kansas. There were more stores now, a second saloon, a proper schoolhouse, a doctor who had come out from Fort Worth and set up a surgery. The town was becoming something more established and permanent, losing its raw frontier edge and acquiring the slower rhythms of a place that intends to be there for a while. Grant watched this happen with the satisfaction of someone who has found his place in a particular geography of the world and intends to stay in it. He was part of the town. Not in a prominent way, he had no interest in politics or official positions, though Crawford asked him twice to consider the county deputy's post, and he declined both times. But he was known and he was trusted, and the horses he cared for were well cared for, and the people who brought him difficult animals or unusual problems found him reliable and honest, and this was, he had concluded, enough. In the spring of 1888, Myrtle told him over breakfast again, with the same careful composure she had brought to the first announcement, that they were expecting again. He was better prepared this time. He set down his coffee, looked at her, and smiled. "Is it more of a smile occasion this time?" she asked, with a faint note of teasing that she had developed over 4 years of marriage. "Last time was also a smile occasion," he said. "I was working on the inside." "I know," she said. "This baby came in November of 1888, a girl they named Clara Myrtle Talbot. Clara for Grant's mother and Myrtle because Myrtle had, characteristically, said she was not interested in elaborate naming conventions, and if they were having a daughter she thought her own name was a perfectly serviceable one to share." Grant had laughed and agreed. Clara Myrtle came into the world in a manner considerably more efficient than her brother's birth, arriving in the early morning before the doctor could be sent for, with only Mrs. Harkin and Grant present, and the experience of being that completely responsible for his wife's safety and his daughter's arrival into the world was something Grant filed permanently in the category of things that could not be entirely described. Clara Myrtle was different from her brother from her first days, calmer in her watchfulness, less immediately vocal in her opinions, with Myrtle's green-gray eyes, and it became apparent as she grew, Myrtle's precise attention to how things worked. Edmund, at 3, received his sister with mixed feelings that he was too young to hide and too honest to pretend otherwise, and Myrtle managed his adjustment with her usual practical wisdom, which involved acknowledging his feelings directly and giving him specific and important responsibilities related to the baby, which he took to with the proprietary seriousness of a small boy who has been trusted with something real. Thomas came with his family in the summer of 1889 for a visit that lasted 2 weeks, and the small rooms above the store were crowded with children and noise, and the kind of warm disorder that Grant had never expected to have in his life, and had turned out to love unreservedly. Thomas's children were 12 and 10 and 7 now, old enough to range around the town with Edmund on their heels like a small devoted satellite, and Thomas and Grant sat on the porch in the evenings and talked in the way that brothers talk when they have come through something together and arrived somewhere better. "You are a different man," Thomas said one of those evenings. "I know," Grant said. "Not different in that you changed," Thomas said carefully. "Different in that you became what you were supposed to be without all the weight on top of it." Grant considered this. Below them the town went on in its evening patterns, the lights coming up in windows, the sound of someone playing music somewhere, the distant pleasant noise of children not quite ready to come inside. "I wasted a lot of years," Grant said. "Not with self-pity, just with the honesty of a man who can afford it now." "You found your way," Thomas said. "The path was what it was." "Myrtle would say that is too charitable," Thomas laughed. "She would say it accurately, and then she would also say that what matters is the arrival, not the path, because that is the kind of person she is." He looked at his brother. "She is good for you." "She is good in herself," Grant said. "The being good for me is a consequence." Thomas raised his cup. "To Edmund and Clara Talbot," he said, "Senior and Junior." Grant raised his own. "To all of them," he said. They drank in the summer evening, and the town went on below them, and the children came inside eventually, and the lights stayed warm in the windows for a long while after. The trial of Calhoun Dread had come and gone and receded, as events do when they have done what they needed to do. Grant received word from a contact in Huntsville in 1892 that Dread had died in the penitentiary of a failure of the heart at the age of 63. He had been in custody for 9 years of the 15-year sentence. Grant read the brief notice in his contact's letter and sat with it for a morning, and then told Myrtle, who listened, and said that she hoped whatever was waiting for Calhoun Dread on the other side of things was proportionate to what he had done. Grant agreed with her. And then they moved on with the day, because the day was full of living things and the past was where it belonged. Grant was 47 years old in 1893, and Sweetwater Creek had become a town of real substance, with a newspaper and a 2-story bank and a courthouse recently completed in the county seat style, and a population that had more than doubled in the 10 years he had been there. The livery had expanded twice, with a full smithy added in 1890, and Grant had taken on 2 assistants, a methodical young man named Ira Glass, and a Mexican vaquero of extraordinary skill named Rafael Mendez, whose horsemanship was the best Grant had ever seen, and who had decided that steady work in a good livery was preferable to the uncertain life of the cattle trail. Edmund was 8 now, and had recently decided that his life's ambition was horses, which Grant had complicated feelings about in the way that a man has complicated feelings when he sees his own nature reflected in a child, and is not entirely sure all of it was worth passing on. But Edmund had genuine talent and genuine love for it, and Grant quietly resolved to make sure that the love was the foundation of it rather than anything driven. Clara Myrtle was 5, and was already reading with her mother's speed and apparent inability to enter a room with a book in it without reaching for something to read. She asked questions with the precision of a natural philosopher, and Myrtle answered them with the seriousness they deserved, and Grant watched these exchanges and felt the full specific joy of seeing his wife and his daughter. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the store was closed and the livery was settled, Grant and Myrtle sat by their fire with their books or their correspondence or their comfortable silence, and the silence was good. It was the silence of people who have said enough things to each other that the quiet between them is full rather than empty, who have built something together and can sit in it without needing to narrate it. He would reach for her hand sometimes, the same way she reached for his without looking, just to confirm. She was always there. In 1895, she had the idea of expanding the store to include a small lending library, because the schoolhouse's supply of books was inadequate and the children of the town deserved better. She organized it with the help of the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Pratt who had come from Austin, and solicited donations from families across the county, and wrote a letter to a publishing house in New York requesting donated surplus copies, which to everyone's considerable surprise produced a crate of 40 books the following spring. The lending library occupied the back corner of the general store and was administered by Myrtle on a system of careful records and reasonable borrowing periods, and by 1896, it was the most heavily used feature of the store, particularly by children, and Myrtle's satisfaction with it was of the deep particular kind she reserved for things she had built that served a purpose she believed in. Grant wrote it up for the county paper at Harlan, because someone should, and the editor published it with a note calling it an example of frontier community spirit. Myrtle read it and said that frontier community spirit was a fine phrase for an editor to use, and that what it actually was common sense and access to books. Grant smiled reading that over his coffee. Edmund's 11th birthday in 1896 was celebrated with a party that involved most of the children of Sweetwater Creek and a horse race of the modest suburban sort that could be managed in the field behind the livery. And Edmund won it on a young bay horse that Grant had been quietly training with him for 6 months, and the expression on his son's face crossing whatever they had designated as a finish line was something Grant kept with him permanently. He thought about his own father watching him from a porch, some unremarkable summer evening before 1863. Edmund Talbot, who had been too generous and who could fix anything mechanical. He thought about the way that children carry their parents forward in ways the parents never see, how a generosity or a way of laughing or a tendency toward horses gets passed down through blood and habit, and the small daily evidence of who someone is. Edmund James Talbot, at 11, had his grandfather's laugh. Grant had not realized this until Thomas pointed it out during a visit, and then he could not unhear it, that laugh, too loud and entirely genuine, the laugh of a man who had nothing to hide about his enjoyment of the world. "He has father's laugh," Thomas had said. "I know," Grant had said, and had been unable to say anything further for a moment. Clara Myrtle, at 8, had her mother's eyes and her own opinions, which she expressed with a clarity that made her teachers simultaneously impressed and occasionally exhausted. She had taken to the lending library with a passion that suggested she had personally needed it to exist, and she worked her way through its shelves with systematic appetite, reporting back on what she had read with the particular combination of summary and criticism that was entirely Myrtle's. The years settled into the long, comfortable rhythm of a life built on solid things. There were harder years and easier years. A drought in 1897 that took a toll on the ranchers who supplied much of the livery's trade and required a period of tightened accounts and careful management. There was a barn fire in 1899, Not at the livery but at the Connolly farm east of town, and half the town turned out to help contain it. And Grant worked through the night with the bucket line, and when it was over and the Connollys stood in the ash dawn, he felt the old familiar weight of fire and loss in his chest. And Myrtle, who had also been there, found his hand in the pale morning without looking. There was a wonderful year in 1900, when the railroad's expansion brought a new wave of trade through Sweetwater Creek, and the livery took on its third expansion, and Myrtle opened a second lending library in a dedicated room she negotiated from the new town hall, staffed by Miss Pratt, who had by now been in Sweetwater Creek for 5 years and shown no signs of leaving. There was the proud and somewhat tearful occasion in 1902 when Edmund, at 17, won the county horse show and received his award from the county judge, and stood on the platform with his grandfather's laugh and his father's dark hair and his mother's composure, and Grant and Myrtle sat in the front row and were entirely, unguardedly happy. There was the morning in 1903, a Sunday in the spring, when Grant woke before Myrtle as he always did and made the coffee and stood at the window of the rooms above the store and looked out at Sweetwater Creek in the early light, the main street quiet, the cottonwoods along the creek in their new green spring leaves, the sky pale and promising. He was 57 years old. His hair was gray at the temples and his face had the lines of a man who had lived outdoors for many years and thought hard about difficult things, and eventually arrived somewhere worth arriving at. Behind him, the door to the bedroom was open and he could hear Myrtle beginning to wake, the particular sounds of it, the slow return from sleep that he knew as well as he knew his own voice. He poured a second cup and brought it to her. She was sitting up, reading already, because she was incapable of lying in bed awake for more than 5 minutes without finding something to read. She looked up when he came in and accepted the cup and looked at him in the morning light. "You are thinking about something," she said. "Always," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she made room with the unconscious ease of a woman who has shared space with someone for 19 years and has long since stopped having to think about it. "I was thinking about the ridge," he said. "About the night of the fire." She waited. "I was thinking that I spent all those years riding toward one moment, and the moment came and passed, and it turned out that the life was this." He looked at the cup in his hands. "It turns out that the life was always going to be this. I just had to get through the other thing first." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Is that how you see it, that you had to get through something first?" "I don't know, maybe it is not that clean." He looked at her. "Maybe I needed to have been that person first in order to be this one. Maybe the 20 years made me someone you could have a conversation with." She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "You are not wrong," she said. The man who rode into this store in 1883 was someone who had been through a great deal and had not yet put it down. The man I married had put it down. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes that 20 years of daily life had not changed in any fundamental way. "I am glad you came to Sweetwater Creek. I am glad of the match that broke my stirrup 3 miles north of town on the morning I arrived," he said, "which caused me to need to stop at the hardware store for a replacement, which turned out not to carry what I needed, and which directed me to the general store." "I remember," she said. "You came in looking for a leather punch and salt." "And matches," he said. "And matches," she agreed. She reached for his hand, he gave it to her. Outside the window, Sweetwater Creek was waking up to its Sunday, the church bell beginning its call from the north end of the main street, the smell of someone's baking already in the air, the sound of horses and the sound of the creek, and the sound of a town that had grown from a crossing, and a trading post into a real and living place, with libraries and courts and schools and families in it who had come from difficult or ordinary places and made something permanent. Edmund appeared in the doorway, 18 years old now and too tall for his own comfort, with his grandfather's laugh already awake in his face. "Are you two going to church?" he asked. "Are you?" Myrtle asked. "Adelia Harkin's family is going," he said, with a casualness that did not fool either of them. Myrtle looked at Grant over the rim of her cup. "Then I suppose we are going to church," Grant said. Clara appeared behind her brother because she was always behind her brother, 10 years old and already a full presence in any room she entered. "Can I read in the pew?" she asked. "No," Myrtle said. "Can I bring a book for after?" "Yes," Myrtle said. Clara disappeared again in the direction of the lending library shelves that had migrated upstairs and now occupied most of the sitting room, and Edmund retreated to make himself presentable, and Grant looked at Myrtle in the Sunday morning, and Myrtle looked at Grant. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. He kissed her and she kissed him back, and it was the same deliberate honesty it had always been, and it was the best thing there was. The bell rang on. Sweetwater Creek went about its Sunday. And Grant Talbot, who had spent 20 years looking for the man who burned his family's homestead, sat in the morning light with his wife's hand in his and was, at long last and completely, home.